everyone. I'm Leanne Wood, part of the public relations and social media team for the show, and your MC on the Smart Stage powered by CE Pro. Next up, who better to troubleshoot common problems with low frequency performance than two engineers named Kevin from Harman, right? Consider this a working session to get great tips and tricks for multi-channel audio systems. Moderated by Bob Archer from CE Pro, please join me on the Smart Stage for your introductions and panel session.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Harman Tech Talk questions, or session, we'll call it. To my left is Kevin Kent. We'll call him KK because we have two Kevins up here. And to my right, or your left, is Kevin Voecks, and we'll call him KV. I'm sorry that I have to wear glasses here, but I'm getting old, and what we're going to talk about is how to maximize low-frequency performance in a multi-channel audio system. We're going to cover some important elements involving the integration of home theater and stereo into home environments. Some of the items we'll cover include the amount and positioning of subwoofers within interior spaces and some of the most common problems associated with putting subwoofers into interior spaces. We'll also talk about some of the ways to avoid the common problems that occur when putting subwoofers into interior spaces. Additionally, we'll talk about Harman's newly updated Sound Field Management 2 low-frequency optimization, room EQ, and correction for subwoofers. It's a dealer tool. As I said, I have Kevin Kent on my left and Kevin Voecks on the right. So, Voecks, I'm sorry, Kevin. I've moved.
All the time.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, we'll get right into this with my first question. Just to provide a basis for what we're going to talk about today, why can't integrators place audio systems into home environments and expect them to perform to their designed capabilities? KV.
Well, at low frequencies, it's really more about the room than it is the loudspeaker. And I say that as a loudspeaker manufacturer. The speaker needs to have plenty of clean, undistorted output as a subwoofer, but below what's called the Schroeder frequency in the few hundred hertz range, it's really the room, the placement of the subwoofers, and the location of the listeners that determines everything. So you can't just randomly place subwoofers and expect because they're long wavelengths that you'll get great performance.
KK, could you elaborate on that? Could you explain specifically why subwoofers present a problem when placed in home environments?
Absolutely. You know, trying to get away with one subwoofer often doesn't work for even one person some of the time, let alone multiple people in a room. So you really want to have even coverage for multiple people, especially if you're going to have multiple rows of seating. It's important that everyone has a similar experience. Adding more subwoofers to the system gives you much lower seat-to-seat variation. So from there, you can start to EQ the room and really focus on the rest of the system. So that really helps tremendously.
Thank you. Okay. KV, are there any sort of guidelines that dealers can follow to help them place subwoofers into home environments, and can they use more than a single subwoofer within a system?
Absolutely. Our research group called Harman X did research on this several years ago and determined that the optimum number of subwoofers is 4. And in a practical application, that means that if you put a subwoofer in each corner, or it could be in a wall near a corner, you get the advantage of the gain from the additional boundaries, but also you're canceling half the room modes just by that subwoofer placement like that, both in the length and width of the room. And then with an algorithm that we call SFM2, we're able to further reduce the seat-to-seat variation. So that's a big change from the past when there was the so-called money seat. Whoever paid for the system got the right response, and anybody else, you got what you got. Now that we can make the low frequency sound very, very similar at every seat, then rather than just having an average that's a compromise for everyone, you have the same low frequency performance, and you can do the global EQ that will really work properly.
Okay. Recently, Harman updated its acoustical software that's available to dealers. Can you explain the updates to the company's sound field management to low frequency optimization, room EQ, and correction software for subwoofers?
Yes, absolutely. So our previous version of sound field management was built into Arcos. It's adaptive room correction optimization system, which was built into our SDEX. So you're basically limited to your given microphone positions and dedicated subwoofer positions, predetermined subwoofer positions, I should say. This one you have a lot more freedom of choosing, taking measurements at multiple locations, moving the subwoofers if needed to find the best placement for the subwoofer, and covering a larger area. One addition that we have to it is choosing from the top 30 solutions. It comes up with hundreds of thousands of solutions within the algorithm, and it spits out the top 30 to you. They're all very low seat-to-seat variation, and you can choose based on your subwoofer type. If you have different subwoofers on the front versus the back, you can choose an option that maybe turns the subwoofers in the back down since they're maybe less capable. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility in that regard.
Okay. KV, how do these new updates specifically help integrators fine-tune audio systems?
Well, what KK just said is worth elaborating on, because most people don't realize that if you use 4 subwoofers and 2 of them are dissimilar, usually of lesser clean output capability, that means that the entire system's dynamic range is limited by the worst components, the subwoofers that have less output capability. And that's a very big deal, because you could have really wasted a lot of money then. So by choosing solutions among those top 30 that have, and intentionally have, 2 of the subwoofers, the rear subwoofers in most cases, attenuated 6 or 12 dB, you literally get that much greater dynamic range in the entire system. So that's a huge, huge asset. You don't have to put the subwoofers in those 4 locations, as KK was saying. SFM will automatically deal with wherever you put them. It doesn't mean you'll get as good a final result with random places, but it will deal with it, because it's important to keep in mind that it's based upon actual measurements. So it's not a model of the room, which are always imperfect, but since they're actual measurements, what it predicts is what will happen.
And the nice thing about that too, just to elaborate on that, our dealers can take these measurements before the room is installed, or before the system's installed. So they have much more flexibility as far as choosing the locations before we come and do the final calibration. So it's really as a part of the design process that we can start to implement this, which is very important.
Okay, Kevin K. Summarizing what we've discussed so far, in order to optimize the system, dealers need to choose the right equipment. They need to work with the homeowner to find the best location for the loudspeakers. And through room design tools like the Sound Field Management 2 program, they need to implement that or utilize it in order to get the best system performance. Would that be a correct summary?
Yeah, that's well said.
Can it be done without those ingredients?
It can. You just have limited options. So if you're unable to, move the subwoofers, for instance, it'll still give you the best options for the predetermined subwoofer locations. You just might not have as much flexibility as where to place those loudspeakers.
And I should add that we actually offer the service to the dealers that we will tell them what components in what locations are going to work best in that system. So it's part of our JBL synthesis services.
How would they take advantage of that, the dealers?
At the very beginning of the project, where they're wanting to quote for a customer, we will design, and usually KK will design, the best 3 options, a good, better, best scenario, that takes into account the volume of the room, their objectives, and things like the screen size and type, in order to determine what's the appropriate amplifier power, what are the appropriate speakers, and the appropriate processor, because we have options for all of those.
Okay, KV, taking a best practices approach to system design and speaker placement, what are some of the other basic rules integrators are to follow beyond subwoofer placement?
For the entire system, we like CEDIA Designer. It's an excellent program that does a great job of assisting in the placement of loudspeakers, because now that immersive audio is what it's all about, people have to think differently than they have in the past, even for 7.1 systems. It's kind of a different world. And so they need to understand that there are new rules for where you place even those bed channels, as well as understanding how you want to get even consistent coverage, because our objective is immersion and being able to make it sound, make it feel like you're in a different acoustic environment. And so we help them, and so does CEDIA Designer, in achieving that.
Before we move on to the next question, can you explain what CEDIA Designer is?
CEDIA Designer is a really brilliant program that takes the specifications that we have provided to them and then gives you help, much like KK does, in what amplifier power is suitable for what loudspeakers in what volume of room to achieve reference level at all the seating locations, as well as where to place the loudspeakers. So in a high channel count system where you can really get a realistic sense of immersion for the first time, it's not a simple task to determine where to best place the loudspeakers. If there's too much space between them, if there's something being panned through that area, you could notice a gap. Or, to me, the most significant thing is you need to do it right to really be able to feel like you're in a different acoustic environment. And so this isn't just for movies. For music, upmixing it to have the 3D component makes it sound more realistic. I mean, it really is higher fidelity if it sounds more like it's the real thing.
One more before we get to the next one. Where can people find CEDIA Designer?
It's a part of CEDIA, so going to the website, you'll be able to find it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now finally on to the next question. KK, what are some of the scenarios or practices to avoid during the design and install process?
Certainly, as Kevin mentioned, the speaker location's huge. One thing we found in a lot of our field work is the angle of the speaker toward the listening position. When you're off axis from a speaker, it has a different frequency response. If you're 60, or even I think we've seen speakers more further off axis than that. So it's really key to have a good frequency response and be on axis with the speaker. I've seen just recently in these new immersive audio systems, it makes a world of difference in imaging and really having the speakers disappear where they should.
Okay. KV, what is Harman doing to help dealers succeed in installing its products? Does the company offer training, webinars, support materials, etc.?
We certainly do, and we're greatly expanding upon and improving that program with e-learning programs that eventually will be able to replace the in-person training so that we have better reach to far-flung countries. In the meantime, we're offering e-learning that is introductory before a training, so that people that are less knowledgeable aren't going to slow everything down for the other people. Then intensive classes in how you do all of the calibration, the speaker locations, that kind of thing with hands-on work. And then soon there'll be e-learning modules with testing for the person to prove their knowledge before they're certified as a system integrator or calibrator.
How would dealers gain access to these materials and these learning opportunities?
Through our website.
KK, is it reasonable to expect that if these best practices are followed and dealers choose the appropriate equipment, that consumers will receive a home theater audio experience that rivals or approaches the typical commercial theater experience?
Absolutely, if done correctly, and they have it's acoustically treated. There's a lot more to take into account than just the speaker system in itself, but the entire environment. But yes, if done correctly, you should have a system that's better than most commercial theaters.
What are some of the hallmarks of that system? Oh, sorry, Kev.
I'll just add to that that's true, and it's not that it's changing the director's intent, but rather that in a commercial theater, you have to get adequate results for a large seating area. In the home, we have the luxury of, even if it's a pretty big theater, it's tiny compared to a commercial theater, and so we can use speakers that have characteristics like their radiation pattern that are going to work better for a smaller area. So we can get a better result while still respecting the artistic intent.
Okay, well, what are some of the, a question for both of you, what are some of the hallmarks of a high-performing home audio system, whether it be home theater or even a stereo system?
Actually, Kevin has one of the best systems I've ever heard.
Well, the lack of coloration is what I would put as number one. So fidelity to the original source. And then if the source is good, it'll sound good. Great, it'll sound great. And if it's bad, it'll be exposed. And that's fine. That's an important part. Having real dynamic capability is very important. And we're able to do that with our low distortion, low coloration horn systems.
Any other characteristics that people could cite when aspiring to assemble a high-performing theater or stereo music system?
Absolutely. The first thing I look for, when you think of just a two-channel stereo system, is imaging. Same goes for a multi-channel system. You want good imaging between pairs of speakers, multiple speakers. So imaging is I think, one of the hallmarks that I look for.
And to expand upon that, because it's not just imaging that we're used to talking about in a two-channel system where there's a virtual image between something, but when you have a high channel count immersive audio system, it can actually change the placement of instruments in the 3D space. And there's an example before equalization of a recording of a big band that was done in an RO3D recording. And with equalization, everything was where it should be, and the band listened on our system and said so. But without equalization, because the timbre at the listening area wouldn't match as well between speakers that are heights or rears with the fronts, you could actually get incorrect placement of musical sources.
Kevin, could you provide some tips for integrators looking to install immersive audio systems? Obviously, with more speakers, it means more potential problems. Could you provide some pointers on installing and specifying immersive audio systems?
Absolutely. There are free tools out there, actually, and really good tools such as a mini DSP, the UMIC 1. It comes with a unique calibration file for that microphone and free measurement tool software. So doing initial measurements before the speaker's installed to know the characteristics of the room, and as well as the speakers in that environment. Using the tools at hand and accurate tools make a big difference.
Kevin, could you provide some tips on stereo configurations, how to optimize stereo configurations?
Well, there are some general rules of thumb, but you have to consider that the placement of the loudspeakers within the modal pattern of the room is going to determine to a large degree how they sound at low frequencies. So equalization is our friend, and fortunately there is more and more acceptance among audiophiles for good room equalization because they're not the crude attempts that you used to see, that they remember the smiley face graphic EQs and things. So I certainly encourage that. There are some easy things like if they're freestanding speakers for a two-channel system that you don't want them excessively close to the front wall. I mean, typically a meter out is going to be required in order to get a good sense of depth and imaging. That you want them to be centered within the room, if at all possible, if it's a rectangular room, because then the reflections from the side walls are going to be similar, and that will aid in imaging. We've done research that has indicated that of all the reflections in the room, and one must consider that most of what you hear is reflected sound, that the first reflections on the side walls is by far dominant in our perception of the sound quality, not just localization. And so it's important that the sound that's reflected from the side walls be very similar to the direct sound in order to make it sound real. There are some things that we just subconsciously perceive, and that adds to realism.
Okay, well, before I get to my last question, I'm not certain if I'm supposed to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. If anyone has any questions, we have an awesome panel up here. If anyone has any questions for Kevin, and you want to ask them, feel free. They're a wealth of knowledge, and we'd be happy to address questions.
Absolutely.
You guys were given some tips about some basic sort of placement of speakers, placement of subwoofers. What would be the sort of ideal scenario in a typical rectangular room?
The ideal scenario for the placement of subwoofers?
Yes.
The four corners in a rectangular room really are ideal. If you look at the research, it shows that the seat-to-seat variability is slightly better if they're placed at the midway points along the wall, or the acoustic midway points, I should say. But not that much better than the corners, and the corners give you the huge advantage of free bass, really, by the reinforcement from the two additional boundaries that you're going to have there, or the one additional boundary.
Kevin, could you tell me what's happening in your booth, in the Harman booth, this year at CEDIA Expo 2019?
I sure can. We have 28 new products, which is pretty amazing. And we have 3 live demonstration home theater systems at a range of prices. So there's a lot to talk about, and new speakers from JBL Synthesis and from Revel, and new electronics, several new models from both JBL Synthesis and from Arcam. And we're showing the latest Mark Levinson models, including the 5000 series that was just recently introduced.
Could you tell us your booth number?
1313.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Kevin Voecks, Kevin Kent. Kevin Kent was also my bandmate last night in the CE Pro All-Star Band. Kevin's a great guitar player. Hopefully next year you can see us all play again. If you have more questions for either Kevin, they will be in the Harman booth. Thank you and good luck at the rest of CEDIA Expo 2019.
Great, thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Bob.